This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.
Hi, I'm Dean Gation, and this is the Powerful Connections podcast. For over 40 years, I've been involved in planning and building high-voltage projects. My company, DGG5 Advising, is the opportunity maker you need for your energy and construction projects. My guests and I are going to share our experiences and how we have brought projects to successful completion. Our topic today is opportunities. My guest is Merv McLeod. He is a director and senior advisor at McLeod Wood Associates, centered in Fergus, Ontario. Merv, maybe give us a short introduction of yourself.
Like Dean said, my name's Merv McLeod. I'm with McLeod Wood Associates. Mainly work in Northern Ontario on large infrastructure projects, mainly transmission, hydrogeneration, and it's been a little while, but mining also. And usually I work with the First Nations themselves and providing the services so they can work with larger firms in the building of these type of projects or negotiations of mining projects and things along those lines.
Merv is an award-winning Indigenous consultant. Merv is a specialist in business relationship building, facilitation, and negotiations. He's focused in the Indigenous world and the power sector, as he stated earlier. His network is very diverse, and his skills in relationship building combined with his public policy experience and training make Merv a great partner for the First Nation leaders and communities. Merv likes to make things happen. He is very well versed in public policy and government channels, and his experience with the Anishinaabe Nation, otherwise known as NAN, and the Ministry of Northern Development, MNDM. We would like to talk today a little bit about opportunities that are happening in how busy the world has been, and we're going to discuss those today. So where do you see your focus today, Merv, with all of these transmission projects coming up?
I guess transition's the right word. The opportunities coming forward in let's just say the regulated sectors are quite significant. Coming out of reconciliation and other various court cases and whatnot over the last decade or so have really changed things. You're seeing lately, and we've seen the announcement by Hydro One, on large transmission projects, the starting point is 50-50 in terms of the equity component. 5, even 4 years ago, that wasn't even on the table. Or there was the odd one here and there. But now it's a starting point. And it's significant in the sense that it signals that for large projects to happen, there needs to be significant Indigenous participation to make that happen. And what's driving it from the Indigenous side is there is a real need to be part of the economic sector. First Nations have not been a significant part of the economy in Canada. And there is a lot of structural reasons for that. But as those structural reasons, such as access to money, access to equity, access, is changing things. And the skills and capacity of First Nations are growing too. That seems to be growing a little bit slower. I think that's the biggest change. And we see it in the news, First Nations buying part of the pipeline out west. They're part of the transmission line with Hydro One building, the Wate line, a significant transmission line going north, which is 51% owned with Fortis, with a transfer process in place. And we look at Five Nations Energy, which is 100% owned transmission line by First Nations on the coast of James Bay. And I remember back when we were doing that project, there was only 2 power projects going in Ontario at that time. It was our Five Nations project And I believe it was Pick River doing the Wawate generation project. And we're only talking, late 90s. At that time, the power sector was dead. And that was the only two projects in Ontario, two First Nation projects. And there was a lot of regulatory change happening at the same time.
So I first met Merv in the mid-90s at the start of the community consultation for the Five Nations Energy Project on the Western James Bay coast. And Merv was a key member of the development team for planning the 269 kilometers of 138 kV transmission line from Moosonee to Attawapiskat. And that was quite a feat. There was many things blocking it. Today's world's a little different. But a couple things I want to cover, Merv. Tell us a little bit about that experience and your involvement, and then we're going to talk about what the difference is from the 90s to today.
The regulatory environment was quite different at that time. When we were started with the Five Nations Energy Project, it was technically illegal to have another transmission line in Ontario. Ontario Hydro was the only legal transmitter. And without significant regulatory change, which we were part of, this company and this project probably would have never went. It was driven by the First Nations on the coast of James Bay and the Tribal Council and the team that was put together. And it was, I put a lot of no's, a lot of failures, but we just kept pushing at it. And eventually we got through and we made this happen. And Five Nations was the first new licensed transmitter in Ontario that was allowed to build and own high voltage transmission other than Ontario Hydro at that time. So that was a significant start of change for transmission in Ontario. And now I don't even know how many licensed transmitters there are. And there are First Nation transmitters with their partners here and there. And also now with Hydro One coming online with their number of significant upgrades, we'll also have a number of significant Indigenous partners with that to make that happen. And one of the things I think that's important to understand with the Five Nations team, the Tribal Council and the leadership there took the position that there was a need to know how to build large projects. And so they selected a team, which I was lucky to be part of. And one of the staff members, a person by the name of Ed Chilton, was our leader. And along with the political people from Mushkegowuk and from the communities, we were able to bring this project and push it forward. But we were also able to develop those skills that are necessary to develop large projects. And I guess in the north and in the First Nations, and those skills have been shared with other northern communities. Ed and I went out a number of talks, and I know Ed did a lot of talking with different groups to share how we move this forward. And
he was in high demand.
Now we look around, you have the Wate line happening, you have membership in the East, partnership in the East-West tie, you have the Bruce to Milton, then new lines, reinforcement from Thunder Bay to Kenora that has significant First Nation involvement with Hydro One. And that pattern is there. And also on the generation side, you see a number of generators where First Nations are involved right across the board. It helps, it helps First Nations. It's coming into the sector, being part of the business sector, cash flow coming into the communities. And those cash flows are mainly used for the benefit of the communities. There is not enough money in the system, in the current system, or how the communities were supported by Ontario and Canada and others. But with these, with more income coming in, lifestyle's better, infrastructure hopefully will be getting better. And that seems to be the pattern as we're moving forward. And that's sort of, I would say it does come out of the Five Nations project, because we were the first. To do something first is always difficult, and breaking the trail. It's a lot easier to do projects that somebody else has done before. And Five Nations was the leader.
It was a major game changer, that's for sure. And I think the players that were in it, still participate today in a lot of the things that are going on, and you're in the middle of a lot of it. So today there is, I think, a big difference in helping create opportunities for the First Nation communities in their local businesses. And I see a lot of difference in the attitudes of people, government and utilities especially. And we talked about the new policy of Hydro One, but what do you feel those differences are today for the leadership and the communities and the local businesses?
Well, it started a few years back when Ontario was doing a fair bit of wind development here, and a process was put in place that enabled the communities, or the First Nation communities, or Indigenous groups, to raise the necessary equity and have the project. And with the project generating enough revenue to pay that debt, plus provide some revenues to the First Nation while the debt was paid. And when the debt was gone, a significant revenue increase. That was a significant change, and I think a significant start. It was here in Ontario of First Nation ownership in the power sector, mainly generation at that time. And now we see things moving along. There's a combination of things. There's programs that make equity loans available, and with the delta between the cost of the loan and the revenue is enabled the debt to be paid, and yet still make some money until the debt's paid. That combined with reconciliation and other systems coming out of that and causing, it was UNDRIP to, some fairly large policy items that have driven this. So you're seeing that change in the Ontario and Canada, where they have significant opportunity of essentially forced or directed their organizations to participate or to work with First Nations in such a way to make things happen. So you're starting to see this leadership from the regulatory industry in Ontario. You get it from Hydro One, you get it from OPG. From the feds, you're seeing it a lot on the funding side, and the ability to get low-cost money. Again, like I was saying, the delta between the revenue and the cost of money is. You're starting to see opportunities where NRCan, looking at new technologies, green technologies, climate change issues, and they're looking at a broader scope, which will enable First Nations to access this sort of help, hopefully, that will make the participation in the sector wider and bring more skilled human resources to bear. And I believe that's right now, we as First Nations are still developing, the workforce still developing the skills necessary to participate in a large way. Like you're seeing, successful projects here and there will have significant First Nations But, I don't know if it's true, but I suspect it is. The amount of successful participation by First Nations is reflective of the human capacity the First Nation has to participate. And as the human capacity increases, I can see the participation growing and growing faster. And there is a lot of catch up because First Nations generally in Ontario and probably Canada also are not part of the private economic sector. And the skills necessary to operate in the private economic sector are just in the process of being developed. And there's a lot of reasons for not that happening, whether it's residential schools, having to leave home to go to high school, people going to school and they're looking to fix their communities and tend to end up being in what they see on a day-to-day basis as social issues, legal issues, and whatnot. So we're starting to see a lot of lawyers, starting to see a lot of people on the social side. There has to be some discussion, I guess, for young people to move into the technical side, whether it's engineering, the workforce, even down to construction project managers. These are stuff we need to build the sector, to make it happen and to make it better for the communities.
In all of the projects that I've been involved in, you've been involved in, the customer or the owner really drives these opportunities and these outcomes. And the big discussion that we've always had is around economic development. And in all of the discussions I'm having, 3 words keep coming up: clarity, capacity, and certainty. And I feel that in these items of opportunity, of whether it's forest management programs, right-of-way clearing, surveying, camp services, project management, skills, subcontracted items, fuel, helicopters, all those things, I do feel there are things that are happening. So what do you feel are the changes in today's world for the First Nations, for these opportunities to provide services?
I'm just coming off a project like that. Certainty is, it's interesting in the sense that if you go back 20, 25, 30 years, and you look at mining, for instance, and project certainty was not a given. One of the things that wasn't settled then and still is not settled between First Nations and Ontario in a large way is land and permitting and operations and consultation and things along those lines. Where you see successful projects that have moved forward on the mining side as well as the transmission side. The companies engaged early with impacted communities, whether it's through some sort of agreement, working together, and to make things happen. And in that way, it created a level of certainty for the mining companies so they can move ahead. And you look at the successful projects, and their relationship with the communities is still strong. And you're also seeing a significant amount of opportunities. Just take, for instance, the Detour gold mine, which I worked on for a community quite a few years ago. I was talking to some folks who work there, and what they remember getting started, you go into the cafeteria, and there might be 10, 15, maybe 20 First Nation people eating in there along the shift change of say 400 people. And that's 17, 18 years ago. Well, anyway, He said, now when you go into the cafeteria, about half First Nation, half other folks. And that just shows, I think, the importance of the early work of creating the relationship between the company at that time. The company at that time went out, talked to the First Nations, made agreements in place, and cooperators agreements, and cooperated. In a sense, you have that mine has been relatively stable from a political point of view. It works, has high employment rates with First Nations. And, if you're looking at, half of the shift First Nations, that's quite significant. And the community I worked for is one of the smaller communities. When we started back then, Detour was one of the projects. Peter Sutherland Generating Station was another project. A little bit on the lower Matagami. Those projects were happening all at that time. We went from about 67, 68% unemployment rate in the community. And as we worked through it and working with the community and, doing things like the chief at that time of the community recognized there needed to be something on. These are the little things that I think are important. Recognize that the apprenticeships in Ontario with grade 12, yet there was a significant shortage of graduate students. And I think this might be Ontario-wide or it might be rural, is there's a number of students who have not completed grade 12. They're short a few credits. And what she put in place is she talked to the Cochrane District School Board. They made a deal. They put a classroom, and they took over actually the chief and council's chambers and turned that into a classroom. By the time the mine was opening, they were turning out students who completing grade 12, so they were ready to go into apprenticeships, and they were starting to move. And this community has gone from, I was saying, 67, 68% unemployment. And last time I checked a few years ago, it was down to about 16%. And that's including people who cannot work. So significant change,
Big
significant
difference.
amount of people in work. And this community is significant in the significant projects got this started. And you're starting to see their name as they're working on other generation projects, looking at transmission projects also. And, that background, those skills, they can move forward. And this community is working well in that way. And there's still a lot of crisis issues in the communities. Most communities have infrastructure issues. The infrastructure gap in Ontario and the communities is significant from what's needed and where it is now. And we're not even talking about meeting growth. We're just talking about trying to meet the current needs. It is quite significant. And that's where like I said earlier, a lot of the monies that the communities are making are going to that. Oh, one other point. The education director for this community, instead of with the projects coming in, the community has also directed a lot of monies toward education. So they're starting to put in a larger number of people through post-secondary and getting those skills that are necessary for participation in growth. So that is significant change from, say, the 90s to now.
Some of the things we take for granted in the outside world is things like education. We created a bunch of new apprentices on the Five Nations Energy Project, but one of the things we had to deal with was driver's license. People don't have licensed vehicles or a need for an official driver's license, which causes you the inability to be insured in a licensed vehicle. So anybody that was on the project, we had to get them through the driver's license process to be able to drive one of the pickups. Just, those simple facts and those opportunities are there. So to be able to get driver's license and be insured and so forth, those are, things that people are going to need, especially if you find a community now is driving the employment at Detour Gold, for instance, or Lower Matagami River, or the Peter Sutherland Senior Project. You got to be able to drive there. It's 180 kilometers from Cochrane to Detour Gold if you're not catching one of the buses that's moving shift around. So, all those little things you think about it, but the opportunities are there. And again, the capacity building, but it takes time, but in a short order. Yes, it was 15, 17 years, but think about that generational change, that the opportunity is there for them now to make an income and a living and help support their family and their communities. It's a big deal. So in all the things that we feel with all these changes of today, the big one we're talking about is in the First Nations projects, or the asset ownership or equity. What do you feel are the really big opportunities in transmission for ownership these days?
Let's start at the beginning there on the structural issues. As we're going north, a lot of the communities now, Highway Traffic Act is not in place, so there's no need for a license. And so you'll have that issue right off the bat. But also with no Highway Traffic Act, there's no vehicle insurance.
No licensed highways, no generated real highways there. It was all winter road.
So
until you got to Moosonee.
Odd discussions where we're actually sitting down talking with insurance companies and learning how general insurance would apply up there, because we did not have vehicle insurance. We couldn't get it. And so in that sense, it's a discussion that you wouldn't have to have it on any other project. So we did that. There's also other little things, in the north. It's changing a little bit, but bank accounts, checks. A lot of companies are now checks automatically go into bank accounts and they get paid that way. A lot of northern remote people did not have a bank account. There's no bank.
We had to do that at Pekanjika.
How do you deal with that? So all sorts of little structural issues.
Education is a big one. In the remote communities, to get a high school diploma, you had to leave at grade 9, 13, 14 years old. You have to leave home and go live somewhere else. It doesn't do well to support a high rate of graduation. Support is needed. What we take for granted in the South, that extra support, at home support, a home life, all those things that are needed to get through school. It's not there. And on top of that, because the parents and grandparents a lot went through the residential school system, there was no positive view of school. There's a large, significant view of school. So, if it's hard to see something that was so difficult and a tragedy, to support it and to tell kids you have to go to school. You have to get these things to be able to move forward, just because the overall view of school is a negative impact. I'm hoping that's changing as things move forward. But we're still, at least in the north, we're still seeing a lot of kids who have to leave home to go to school at high school, not when they're a bit older and they go to college and university. They're leaving to go to grade 9. Do you feel the fiber system brought in by Five Nations Energy is helping with distance education to kind of alleviate some of that today with a lot of the online education available?
part of the goal was to increase fiber, to be able to bring more information up quickly and to be able to use fiber to better the education systems in the communities. I see systems where, online classrooms, you can bring expertise up, and hopefully that will increase, allow people to see more, to understand more, to do much more before having to leave to go to school or come back. That's sort of my hope and dream.
Do you feel that the new approach is helping with employment opportunities?
I think so. One of the problems on the Wate line, I worked for 6 communities. We had that approach. There was, we trained some of the people. But when things happened, we had COVID, we had other issues. But from a human resource side, I think that was a significant issue because we just didn't have access. And when the communities were so closed, if people came out for 2 weeks, then they had 2 weeks of isolation. So to go into the project, they were essentially isolated from home while they were working. But when they went home back to the community, then they were isolated in their own house for another 2 weeks.
Yeah.
So that didn't make for a good work environment. Yeah. So our success during COVID times was quite low. And we did train people as a subcontractor. The fires, unfortunately, we did burn a lot of fiber up there. Yeah, and on the right-of-way clearing and things along those lines. And we provided some of the training, the fire training that was needed. And so those sorts of things. And we had a good amount of people working. And what I would think is, if we're going on a project like this again, and there will be, is the need to start earlier, especially on the human resource development side. It's how would I put it? Take mining, or even a journeyman electrician, or journeyman lineman. Those are 4 or 5 years. There's a significant amount of prep that has to go before they even enter the apprenticeship process and things along those lines. And those need to be understood. And because when a project starts to move, we as First Nations are generally behind because we don't have yet an established workforce. We don't have journeyman electricians in a wide enough or in a breadth that's wide enough that we don't have the numbers that people see it as a profession. And like you have the journeyman here, you have a substation tech here, there, but people are not seeing those. We need to increase that. We need to have people in apprenticeship. And when a project happens, our workforce is ready. Right now, that's not true. And I'll go back to the mining example. Mentioned the change, with the early stages, there was very few people. The mine process, you hear about, like we're hearing about Ring of Fire. You hear about it, everybody assumes it's going to happen. But it's not going to happen until there's a decision to mine. And when you look at mine development and the decision to mine by the company, and when a mine opens, let's say it's about 3 years on a larger mine, 2 years on other mines, and you're taking 4 or 5 years to develop a miner, you're already behind the 8 ball when the mine starts construction. And the part of that is we don't have a ready workforce because we're training for specific projects. Until there's a wider amount of people who have that basic training or basic education and stuff that is necessary to enter, we will continue to be a little bit further behind. And this is, I'm hoping it's changing. I think it is. When a mine opens or a large project happens, we will be our workforces will be ready. And right now they're not, decision to mine, decision to build a large project. That's when training dollars start to flow, and it's late.
We did create the line crew ground support here at Sudbury at Cambria, and that was kind of a follow-up to the Powerline Technician course we created back in 2006, and it is having its impact and so forth. But, when you're doing 24 to 48 people a year, it's not giving you the numbers that you need. So, these programs need to expand and be elsewhere. And like you said, the training and the essential training and the skills training and just basic safety awareness, basic skills, pre-apprenticeship stuff, all those things need to start right away and be ongoing forever. So those are good points to make. With the IESO working on creating more relationships with Indigenous communities in their Indigenous sector, and same with Ministry of Energy has an Indigenous Energy Policy Unit, do you see the new opportunities for transmission and generation just growing at a large pace, and how do we sustain them when we get to operations and maintenance? Where do you see these opportunities with the IESO requirements?
You have to go back a number of years. ISO has been giving the information out and they've been changing and bettering their programs over the years. And because of the ISO, there is more awareness in First Nations of what can be done in the sector, right? As opposed to, somebody else coming in, somebody else doing this, and the lights go on, sort of thing. And with ISO out there, you're not only looking at distribution in the communities or elsewhere for jobs, looking at generation and transmission also as potential opportunity. One, for workforce, and two, to bring more revenue into the business, not only from supporting the community, but increasing income levels in the community. And hopefully more money gets spent in the communities and develop those economies a bit more. And with the change on climate change and the change to electricity, we're starting to see that refocus on natural resources that are required for the new economy. And when communities are not ready, there's pushback. Like we see that. We see the communities pushing back on development. A big part of it is they're not ready. Various governments, the First Nation governments, the Ontario government, Canada government, the provincial governments in Germany, they do need to come to some resolution on how they're going to do this, as opposed to Canada or typical constitutional wars. You see it between the province and the provinces in Canada. But First Nations are also a recognized government, so they're part of these constitutional discussions. And without those being resolved in a really good way, what do you see? Court action. And court action slows everything down.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's still, I don't know what the numbers are, but when I read the news, the First Nations are still winning most of those court actions.
There was a young lady that used to work for me, and she's an environmental planner and organizer in a lot of projects, and she's been on the Pekanjikam project and Henvey Inlet, and she's worked Trans Mountain and so forth. And she always comes to me and says, it's amazing how you interact with the communities on the projects and how they quickly become entrenched in the planning. And it's from knowledge, awareness, and detail of the information. And it's astonishing how helpful they are towards the success of the project. And those are the things that we've always found have been very easy to deal with. And we've dealt with them based on where we are. So we've talked a little bit about South versus North, and we've talked about capacity a little bit today. And I'm going to move along up to some of the things that we see that are involved in the communities and the benefits. And, you've always been and are a big advisor in Ontario for many of the First Nation leaders and communities, as well as many tribal councils. And I know you are always talking about the cultural translation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and your firm's been involved in many things. And what do you feel our listeners need to hear about what you do and how you help communities to get to the leaders and get to the benefits? How do we get those things going, and where's your biggest impact?
Well, one of the things when you look at the communities, the difficulty with what we do on these large infrastructure projects, long lead times, putting in the basis of, I guess, for communities and to support the infrastructure, to support growth and things along those lines. First Nations and First Nation leaderships, with the issues been happening with what's going on, whether it's housing, whether it's education, whether it's health, drug issues, they're all crisis issues. And First Nation leadership are dealing constantly with crisis. And that's what gets most of the attention. Here we're talking sustainable power 10 years down the road. And yet you have a shortage of housing in the community. What gets your attention?
Correct.
And so the difficulty is there. And the recognition that it needs to be solved is also difficult to come. The resources that are coming in are going in to deal with the crisis issues and that long-term planning aspect. Especially on the economic development side, which transmission and generation from a First Nation perspective is. Like, it will provide stable electricity, decent cost electricity, all this sort of stuff. Replace the diesels. But on a larger scale, it is economic development. And it is also as a result of Canada putting things in. I'll just go back a couple of steps. Why do communities have diesel? Why do they have electric heat? Why do they have electric water heaters? The capital cost for all those, it's cheap. It's cheap to put these things in. Expensive to operate and maintain, but cheap to put in.
Mm-hmm.
Electricity, on the other side, if you're going to put in reliable, low-cost electricity, the capital cost is extremely high. We're talking transmission or new types of generation, whether it's wind or solar or hydro. The upfront capital cost is significant. So, from a policy perspective,
pay me now or pay me later.
That's exactly it.
Yeah.
And so you see all this now. What are the difficulties with it? You see, why is Canada reacting to remote communities? I'm not sure it's need. It might be because diesels produce carbon. Diesel has the potential of putting fuel spills. And those are the arguments that seem to win at the front end. Not the capital, not the cost, not the long-term operations cost.
Even though they're really expensive to run now, they're not the priority discussion.
Yeah. So in a sense, it's still, you have to justify capital. And you justify the capital cost by long-term costs. And with the cost of diesel fuel going through the roof, it's getting easier to justify large transmission.
The avoided cost model of Five Nations Energy is still true today.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
And it's fairly straightforward.
It is pretty straightforward. Why can't we get the change done? So let's make it happen.
Go back to policy perspective. It's changing now. O&M dollars is a different vote from capital dollars.
Yeah, True.
and how to change O&M dollars to support capital, at least in the First Nation policy side. I see them doing it in justice and building courthouses and other things. But on the First Nation side, it's not there yet.
Not quite there. So we're coming up on our time. Been kind of touching on a lot of stuff. This has been an amazing, tremendous discussion. I think it'll open up a lot of eyes to people. And any final real closing remarks that you want to leave people with?
I think as we go forward, the First Nations participation more in the private economic sector is going to benefit the communities. You know, up until this point, most where I work anyway, the northern stuff, is the sector is public. You know, it's government jobs and welfare. And very little real private sector. And the only type of private sector we've seen is, you know, low end bidding. Somebody comes in from the south, brings everything in because it's a cost factor, comes in, gets it built and leaves. It doesn't leave a significant impact on the workforce or trained people in the communities. If we're going to build an economic sector, we need to build the workforce. We need construction managers. We need project managers. And I always remember the First Nation engineers always saying, we need First Nation engineers. Give us 100 First Nation engineers and you will see change.
Yep, that's for sure. Merv, thank you very much for joining me today in Powerful Connections. Your insights are tremendous. This is a lot of information to take in. In our next episode, we're going to talk about relationships. It's going to be a special guest, one of my older brothers. We recently retired him out of being the CEO of Waterloo North, but this will be an interesting one, so please tune in. Thanks for listening to this episode of Powerful Connections. Get in touch with me on my website at dgg5advising.com or find me on LinkedIn at Dean G. Gation. See ya in the next episode.